I'm a lawyer and I'm a senior planner at the Vera Institute. And what I want to talk to you all about today is, you heard how oftentimes when bail gets set, people can't actually make their bail. And so what about if judges set a bail that people can actually afford? And so I want to start by asking you all a question, and I want you to raise your hands if you can do what it is I'm asking in the question. And so here's this, is say you got arrested when you go outside on Malcolm X and 135th Street, and you get taken to central bookings and bail gets set on your case. If bail got set at $10,000, how many of you, and raise your hands, how many of you could make that today at arraignments? Yeah, right? I would have to call my mom, call my friends, but I think they would get that money together. They'd be able to make $10,000 bail for me. And looking around the room and seeing who is raising their hands, it looks like maybe 15–20% of you could make $10,000 bail. So what if bail got set, $10,000, but you only had to pay 10% of that in order to get out? So $10,000 bail set, but you only have to put up $1,000. How many of you could do that? So a lot more of you could do that. Like that's literally maybe 85, almost 90% of this room. And then what about if bail got set at $10,000, but you actually didn't have to pay anything up front? You basically make a promise to the judge, I will come back to court. If I don't come back to court, then I'm liable for the $10,000, but otherwise I can go home. How many of you could do that? All of you, right? Exactly, not a trick question. And so here's the crazy thing, is under New York law, judges can actually set bail where you only pay 10% of the full amount. Or judges can set bail where you actually pay nothing. And that is this thing that has been in New York law since 1970. Yet, as you heard from Nick and Liz and Phoebe, judges basically rarely, if ever, set those forms of bail. They set full cash bail, or they make you go to an insurance company bail bond to pay your bail. And so the question I had, and I was a public defender in the Bronx before coming to Vera, the question I had is, first of all, why don't judges set that kind of bail, a partially secured bail where you pay 10%, or an unsecured bail where you pay none of it? And what would happen if judges started setting those forms of bail? And so we at Vera started this study where we went out and we talked to all the defender agencies around the city, and we said, look, we want you guys, in appropriate cases, to ask judges to set a partially secured bond, or ask judges to set an unsecured bond. And what we found is when defenders started asking for these forms of bond, all judges started setting it, which is not true at all. That's not true at all. But what we did find is that there were 15 judges across New York City who were willing to set these different forms of bond. And there were about 100 cases that we could take and study and find out what happened. What happened with these cases? What happened to these defendants? Did they come back to court? Were they even able to get out, say if a partially secured bond was set? And so what you heard before is that when bail gets set, only about half the people on who bail gets set are able to afford bail if the bail is a cash bond or is an insurance company bail bond. What we found in our study is that when a judge sets a partially secured bond where you only have to pay 10% of it, in fact, 80% of people actually get out. And that's a tremendous, tremendous difference. 30% more people are able to afford their bail. And here's the other thing we found, is that when people make their bail, even without a ton of money hanging over their heads, they come back to court. Of those 100 cases, we tracked to see who comes back to court, how often they're coming back to court. And what I found were that only 2 people warranted. And of one of those people, this person, he didn't come to court on a Friday, and then he was there in court very first thing that Monday and cleared up the warrant. So clearly that's not somebody who's looking to sort of bolt and not come back to court on their case. And so in closing, here are the 2 real lessons that I think we can take and learn from this. And I'll give you sort of the bad news first, which is of folks who had partially secured bond set in their case where they still needed to put down 10% of that money, there were still 20% of people who couldn't make that, which should still trouble us that there are 20% of people, even with a partially secured bond, who actually just don't have enough money to pay their bail. And in one case, it was a young man who was arrested for hopping the train, a turnstile jump, and he had $500 bail set in a partially secured bond. And in his case, he ended up spending about 7 days in jail, and then he took a plea. So what does that tell us? That tells us that that's the extent of some people's poverty who are in the system where they can't pay $50 to get out of jail. And so that still tells us that money, perhaps, holds some people in even when it's a very, very little amount. But here's the good news, is what we also know is that people don't need a ton of their own money wrapped up to come back to court. The fact that 98% of people, at least in the 100 cases that we studied, came back to court really should tell us people don't need their own money wrapped up to come back. And so what we want you to do is to stay tuned for a report that we'll put out later in the year about these forms of bail, and for people to think largely about what can we do with bail, and does cash bail even need to be part of somebody's case in order to get them to come back to court?